Good morning. We'll just wait a minute for people to get joined to the webinar. There's over 100 who have registered, so we'll give a minute so that everybody can get on. Okay, I see those numbers have stopped climbing quickly, so we'll get started. Good morning and welcome to the Healthy Aging Core webinar, A Practical Guide to Elder Abuse and Neglect Law in Canada. It's Barbara McMillan and I'm Provincial Coordinator for Community Engagement with United Way of BC's Population Health Team, and I'm really pleased to introduce this very important learning event today. So I'd like to begin by recognizing that I'm speaking today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And as this is a pan-Canadian webinar with participants from all over the country, we also acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territories of all First Nations on which we gratefully work and gather. A little bit of housekeeping to manage the session and ensure good audio and visual quality. There are a few details we need to point out. Everyone but the presenter will remain muted and cameras will be off. Feel free to introduce yourself and where you're joining from in the chat box. And you can also post your questions there and I'll be monitoring them. And at the end of the presentations, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on Healthy Aging Core along with the slides in the next couple of days. So you'll be able to access them there. And also following the webinar, participants will be sent a brief survey to provide feedback, and we really encourage you to look for that and let us know what you think of the session as well as ideas you might have for future webinars. For today's session, I suspect that everyone working or volunteering in the community-based senior serving sector is aware that elder abuse takes many different forms and affects many of our more vulnerable residents, and also that it's significantly underreported. A report last year from the Federal Department of Justice stated that about 10% of Canadian seniors 65 and older are victims of crime. The report also confirmed that many crimes against seniors are not reported to police, but are reported to health professionals, community groups, and financial institutions agencies. And so today's topic is particularly important for our network as you all play important roles in prevention and intervention. So I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Krista James, the National Director of the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, who will provide an overview of the new practical guide to elder abuse and neglect law that was created by the Centre, and she'll explain how you can use the guide to support your work with older people and vulnerable adults. Krista's work at the Centre is focused on law and policy issues linked to aging and human rights law. Since being called to the bar almost 25 years ago, she's worked with women's centers and various nonprofit community organizations serving low-income people in BC, as well as being a legal advocate and a victim assistance worker. Krista encourages approaches to aging policy that recognize the citizenship rights of older people and reject systemic ageism. And we really appreciate Krista taking the time to be with us here today. So now I'll turn the session over to her.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay, Barb? Yeah, thumbs up? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you to the United Way for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here to talk about our practical guide to elder abuse and neglect law in Canada. Some of you may have used it before when it was on our website as a French and English PDF. And the exciting news is that the new version is a website in French and English with lots of links. And so I'm hoping it's a much more useful tool to everyone. I'm running two computers today. So here's what I want to do in my presentation today. I'm going to provide an overview of the new practical guide. I will outline the guide's key features, and then I'm going to demonstrate some of them by taking you to the website, just for a quick review of the website. I will provide an overview of some key provincial and territorial laws that are particularly relevant to elder abuse and neglect response in the second part of my presentation. I'll do it a bit comparatively so you can see how things are in different parts of Turtle Island. And the three types of laws I'm going to focus on in my presentation today are adult protection legislation, family violence legislation, and laws that apply specifically to long-term care. As Barb mentioned, you will get a PDF of my slide deck after this talk, and it will have links to all the legislation and all the different publications that I talk about. So you don't need to feel too stressed about taking notes and writing down URLs. If you need it sooner, I'm happy to email it to you. I'm planning to talk for about 45 minutes and then leave some time for question and answers at the end. This is going to be a fairly high level overview of both law and the guide because there's so much. The laws that I will talk to you about today are largely colonial constructs, but you can use the guide to look at more specific parts of the law to apply to your work. We also have a section on the practical guide that talks about laws that apply specifically to Indigenous people, Indigenous older adults living on reserves. And so I'll speak to that very briefly in my talk, but there's a fuller section on our guide. If time permits, I'm going to say something about some best practices for responding to abuse and neglect, because the law doesn't always kind of tell us exactly what to do. There's a lot of kind of judgment and problem solving that goes into elder abuse and neglect response. So just a few disclaimers as I start this out. So laws, as I mentioned, are colonial constructs for the most part, although some bands will have, and nations will have specific policies that apply to abuse and neglect response. So I encourage you to get to know them if you're working with communities who live on particular reserves. I cannot give you legal advice about this stuff, and if you ask me a question, please don't share people's confidential information. Try to ask a general question about the law. If you're concerned that your question might somehow reveal identity, please just send me an email after, and I'll try to direct you in an organization who can answer your question if I cannot. But it's really important to protect people's confidentiality. There's a lot of people listening today. So just briefly about the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, which is where I work. We do research and we develop reports and educational tools about legal and policies related to aging. We don't generally give legal advice. We don't help people with specific problems. There are organizations like Seniors First BC and advocates across the country who do that kind of work. The Canadian Centre for Elder Law is part of the British Columbia Law Institute, which is BC's independent, non-profit law reform agency. And you'll see when you get the slide, there's a link to the URL for the CCL, so you can look up the different projects that we're working on. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but I wanted to send you the slide so you would get the hyperlinks. We have always a lot of projects on the go at the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, and so this slide gives you links to 4 of our most kind of significant ongoing projects right now, in addition to the practical guide. They all concern older people. They relate to healthcare, helping people who've experienced abuse and neglect in different ways. And so I encourage you to take a look at these different projects in your own time and learn more about the ones that relate to your work. So let's look at the practical guide. This slide gives you just a quick image of the landing page, and you'll see on the right is the link to the URL. It's CC Elder Law, which hopefully is the same as our Twitter handle for the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, CC Elder Law. The Practical Guide to Elder Abuse and Neglect Law in Canada is a French-English bilingual website. What that means is there's a little button you can press to always change from English to French or back and forth. I'll show you where that is in a moment. The guide has modules on the law in each province and territory, because the laws can be quite different in Ontario compared to BC, compared to the Northwest Territories, and it's really important in your own work to be thinking about the laws that apply where you live. We do provide a summary of key federal legislation, so legislation created by the Government of Canada as well, but most of the laws that apply to you're thinking about what to do when you're concerned about an older person who has been abused or neglected are going to be provincial laws. And to some extent, that boils down to us federalism and the breakdown of powers in the Constitution. So, and a law created by the federal government doesn't necessarily apply everywhere just because it's a Canadian law. So you need to be aware of provincial and territorial laws. Our website also includes a set of lenses for inclusive practice that I'll highlight more in a moment, and a set of 12 guiding principles for best practice. I'm going to go through 4 of them, but I strongly encourage you to look at the guiding principles for best practice. In some ways, they're easier to understand and remember than the laws, and folks have said they're enormously helpful in their work. So this is just a flash of what is covered in each of the provincial territorial modules. So if there's adult protection laws, we explain them. We cover all laws that apply to responding to abuse and neglect in long-term care. We explain family violence legislation where it applies to abuse and neglect. We cover employment laws that relate to a person taking leave when they've experienced family violence, because an older person who is experiencing abuse and neglect can often falls under that category of family violence often. People are usually abused by people in their families. We also cover some policies like privacy and confidentiality, criminal prosecution policies, immigration sponsorship breakdown, and when older people who are dependent immigrants can get help from income assistance in spite of a sponsorship relationship. We also provide information on financial abuse, who are the substitute decision makers for finance, and what to do if you're concerned, and what to challenge their authority in some way. I think Barb may have mentioned that financial abuse is a very common form of elder abuse in Canada. And we also have a quite lengthy section for each module on key agencies that can provide assistance and maybe complement the work that you can do in assisting an older person, so that you can provide a really informed referral for other kinds of services. As I mentioned, we covered lenses for inclusive practice in this new version of the guide. There's about maybe 5 pages on each lens, and there are some links for further learning. The lenses that we talk about that I think are very important to apply to your elder abuse work are trauma-informed practice, cultural safety and humility, having an age-friendly or dementia, disability-friendly practice, how to be more inclusive, how to think about applying gender dynamic awareness to your work, because the experience of gender can have a huge impact on the experience of abuse and neglect. And we also have a section on sexual orientation and gender identity inclusion, how to bring that kind of lens to your inclusive response. Just a quick shout out to our funders. So the major funder was the Government of Canada, Victims Policy Branch, but we also had funding in BC from the BC Association of Community Response Networks, and the Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario has recently joined on as a funder. So, and I'll come back in the end on why this funding has been so important to this work and will continue to be important to keeping the guide alive. So before I go into talking about provincial and territorial laws, I'm just going to switch my screen share to show you the website. Let's see if I can get this right. All right. Can you see the website okay now, Barb? I'll just assume you'll come on the screen and tell me if you can. Okay.
Yes, you can see it, yeah.
Great.
Good.
Okay. So this is the landing page for the practical guide. Just very quickly, you see in the right-hand corner, there's a button that says Français, and when you hit the Français button, it's going to take you to a French version of everything, and then you can click the English again and go back to English. One of the most important parts of the guide is this drop-down box at the top here. So right under the heading, Practical Guide to Elder Abuse and Neglect Law in Canada, there's a little drop-down box here that says Select a Province and Territory. When I do that, I can choose whatever province, and I'll choose BC because I think a lot of our listeners are from BC. That's going to take me to a page that has quite a bit of detail on BC laws. So you see there's 12 different sections. If I scroll down, in print, this is about 30 pages of information. The second section is a snapshot. So each section's fairly similar in structure. So we start with the table of contents, and that's replicated here on the left side, but with hyperlinks to each of those sections. So the second section is a snapshot, and I'm just going to quickly jump to that. So it just tells you in a nutshell some of the key parts of the BC legal framework. It's very high level, but if you want just a quick overview of key laws in BC, this is the place to start. Then the second section says key laws and regulations. I'm going to jump to that here. And you see this has written down all the most critical laws that are relevant to abuse and neglect response in BC, and they appear in red because there are hyperlinks. And so when I click the law, such as the Adult Guardianship Act, and I'm just going to click that right now, it opens up a new window, and it will show you it'll take you to CanLE, which is a free website that anybody can go to find more information on laws, and it takes you to the legislation. We open it up in a separate window so that you can go back to the main page. If you click another piece of legislation, it's going to open that up in another window as well. So there are more, and then if you want to know more about how the Adult Guardianship Act works in BC, you scroll down, and this section gives you much more detail about all what we think are the most critical parts of Part 3 of the Adult Guardianship Act, which is our regime for responding to abuse of vulnerable adults. Now, so the profiles are just one part of the guide. So I'll take you back to the landing page. See, practical guide home. In addition to the little lengthy modules, we have a section on abuse and neglect, which is more general, not specific legal content. We have our guiding principles for best practice. The lenses I mentioned, there's a glossary of terms. And you'll find within the guide sort of hyperlinks to different parts of it. So for example, I'm opening right now our guiding principles for best practice. There are some hyperlinks and they will show up as red. So for example, guiding principle 8 is develop a trauma-informed practice. We have a section on that in the guide, so this hyperlink, when you select it, will take you to that section on trauma-informed practice. If you would like to print any part of the guide, I often get that question, how do I print it? There's a little button in the right-hand corner here that says print, and when you press that print button, what it's going to do is open up this print option, and you can choose to print as a PDF or you can print to your printer. Once you form the PDF, you can save as much of the document as you want. Right now, I'm just going to cancel this. The guide is updated in terms of the legislation to today's date. I just updated last week to reflect the new legislation for Ontario on long-term care, but we will continuously be updating it. And there's supposed to be a page on when there was a last update. That's going to be a feature we'll add shortly, so you can always tell. But for now, you know, as far as I know, it's accurate for all the legislation. So I think that covers some of the key features, and what I'm going to do is now change my screen share and go back to the slideshow. And what I want to do is talk more about the legislation. And I'll have time at the end for questions about both the website and legislation. All right, so key provincial and territorial laws that it's important for you to know about. As I mentioned earlier, the laws that I want to talk about today are adult protection laws, family violence laws, and laws that apply to long-term care. There are other laws that apply to abuse and neglect response. You know, every jurisdiction has some unique legislation. I'll give you an example. Manitoba has a whole statute that applies to vulnerable adults living with a disability, so people who've had a disability since the onset of adulthood, and so there are different options for responding and responsibilities for responding in Manitoba to that population. Quebec, uniquely, Quebec's Human Rights Commission has a mandate to respond to exploitation of older people. And that's very unique. In most jurisdictions, human rights commissions respond only to discrimination specifically, not to exploitation. So you can see there are some different things about different jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions, including BC, the public guardian trustee has some role to play in responding to abuse and neglect. I'm not going to go into that too much detail today. I'm just going to focus on these three statutes for now. But the PGT has a good website that provides you with a lot of information. So just quickly, it's different in every jurisdiction in Canada. Each province and territory has taken a unique approach to developing laws, creating public agencies who are responsible to responding to abuse, and funding nonprofit agencies to support seniors who are vulnerable, who have experienced abuse. This is just every jurisdiction, it's a policy choice, what they've decided to do, and I won't offer any opinion today on who's doing the best job. It's different provinces have different needs, and I do not want to get pulled into that complicated question of who's doing it best, because it's a hard question to answer. So first, briefly, adult protection laws. Adult protection laws apply broadly to abuse of vulnerable adults. So in a sense, they're not limited to elder abuse and neglect, right? They're going to apply if there's abuse of a younger adult who meets the mandate of the legislation in terms of being in need of protection, but is not a senior. Our adult protection legislation is also broader in the sense, particularly in BC, it applies not just to abuse, neglect, but also applies to self-neglect and allows an agency to respond if there are reported concerns about self-neglect of a vulnerable adult. Adult protection legislation applies to adults in need protection, so that means it also is narrower than abuse and neglect. That means that not every case of abuse and neglect is going to be within the jurisdiction of adult protection laws. Many seniors are able to take care of themselves. They are not adults in need of protection. They understand what's going on, and they have a right to make choices about what to do when they're living in a situation where they're experiencing abuse, just like anyone younger than them. So that kind of legislation applies to them, and we need to respect the rights of seniors and not behave in a paternalistic way in responding to abuse and neglect. Adult protection legislation will define key terms like what is abuse, what is neglect. It'll indicate what kinds of abuse are covered, and it'll create some powers to respond in the context of the response framework. Not every jurisdiction in Canada has adult protection legislation, but a number do. So this slide shows you the jurisdictions that have some kind of adult protection provisions in their laws, and I've provided links. So the blue shows you you'll get links to legislation. So Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland have self-contained adult protection legislation that applies just to responding to abuse, neglect, or self-neglect of vulnerable adults. Quebec has taken a unique approach, and they have a more lengthy legislation that is called the Act to Combat Maltreatment of Seniors and Other Persons of Full Age in Vulnerable Situations. It's quite different from these other statutes. BC has a larger Adult Guardianship Act, and Part 3 of this legislation covers the adult protection provision, and you'll see lots of similarities to Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland in BC's adult protection provisions. Yukon also puts its adult protection provisions inside a much larger law, Adult Protection and Decision-Making Act. It's quite an enormous statute. It's very interesting what they've done in Yukon. But the same person drafted the adult protection provision, so you'll see, again, quite a few similarities across the adult protection provisions. And then New Brunswick sort of has adult protection legislation. It has a law called the Family Services Act, which was mostly designed to respond to abuse and neglect of children, but it does have a small section, section 34 to 42, that provides some powers for the state to respond to reports of abuse and neglect of vulnerable adults, seniors. So adult protection legislation, oops, sorry, didn't mean to jump ahead there. Adult protection legislation gives some very broad powers. This list here comes from BC's legislation. So the agencies that respond to abuse and neglect in BC under legislation have the power and the responsibility to conduct investigations. They can access otherwise private information. They can enter premises and examine the adult with a court order. They can make a report to police or PGT, the public guardian trustee, and must in some circumstances. They can get a no contact order to require a person to stay away from the older person or experiencing abuse, neglect, or self-neglect. They can develop a support and assistance plan, which is really about identifying services, health and social services that could help the older adult be in a better situation. They can make the older person follow this support and assistance plan if they get a court order to do so. And they do have powers to remove the adult and require them to get healthcare treatment in an emergency situation without getting a court order. So that's quite a lot of power. They can intervene and remove the adult if they're concerned a person may be being abused and neglect or self-neglecting, and staff feel there's an urgent situation. So I often hear about mandatory reporting, and not all of these statutes require mandatory reporting, but they do give an office a job of mandatory response. So just from a comparative perspective, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland there's a public duty on every adult to report abuse and neglect when it meets the criteria of adult in need of protection. So in Prince Edward Island and Quebec, there's not a mandatory duty to report for everyone, but certain individuals will have a duty to report, generally if they have a caring relationship with that person, like maybe they are a social worker or a healthcare worker. And in the bulk of the jurisdictions, there is no general public duty to report abuse and neglect, and that includes BC. Oops. I just want to mention, so in BC, who responds to abuse and neglect, we call them the designated agencies, and you can find them on our practical guide. But in BC, the agencies which have a responsibility to respond to reports of abuse and neglect are the health authorities, Providence Healthcare, and Community Living BC in terms of adults living with an intellectual disability. So that's all I'm going to say about adult protection law for now. So the second kind of legislation I want to cover is family violence legislation. So there are two reasons why I feel it's really important to cover family violence legislation with you today. And one is that most legal summaries of abuse and neglect or discussions of abuse and neglect response treat adult protection legislation as the only statute that exists to respond to abuse and neglect. And that's a kind of oversimplification of our toolbox. And I'd like to dispel that myth. And the second reason why family violence, or maybe there's three reasons. The second reason is that family violence legislation is everywhere. So every single province and territory has some kind of legislation that allows people to apply, or the older person to apply to get a protective court intervention. And then the one other thing about family violence legislation that I think is useful to underscore is that when you're getting a protection order, usually that older person would be seeking the order themselves with the help of someone, and that's the older person choosing what to do. Adult protection legislation is a kind of legislation we need to use carefully because it is taking the power away from the person in deciding what to do to respond to abuse, right? We're responding for them. We're phoning someone else to get them to fix the problem. Family violence legislation arguably helps the older person to maintain more agency, and that's important because people experiencing abuse and neglect are often in a position where they have their power taken away all the time by an abusive relationship. Abuse is really, a crime of power control. So family violence legislation defines family violence, defines family member, applies to family violence and risk. So in a sense, it is broader than adult guardianship legislation or adult protection legislation. It provides for response before the violence has happened. It allows courts to intervene by making some kind of protection order, and that's really what they're for. It's for getting court orders. And the legislation will say who can apply for an order. This slide shows you the jurisdictions in Canada that have family violence specific legislation. So this is, I think, 10 jurisdictions. I'll get to the other 3 in a moment. You'll see a kind of pattern in the naming of the legislation: Protection Against Family Violence Act, Victims of Interpersonal Violence Act. So these are all self-contained statutes that apply to violence against someone living in a family relationship. And remember, most people experiencing abuse are being abused by someone in their family. So there are a few jurisdictions, including BC, where we don't have specific family violence statute, but we do have a legislation on family violence kind of sandwiched in another statute. So in BC, you find the family violence legislation in BC's Family Law Act under Part 9. Ontario similarly has a part of their Family Law Act to deal with family violence provisions. And in Quebec, you will find the family violence provisions in the Code of Civil Procedure. I also want to mention on the slide, there is a federal statute called the Family Homes on Reserves and Matrimonial Interests or Rights Act, kind of the law created by the government of Canada, and it applies to abuse occurring on on reserves. So if an Indigenous person is experiencing abuse or neglect on reserve, this legislation is available to you. Family law legislation also applies on reserve, except in terms of property. So um, if a person is experiencing abuse and neglect, an older person living on a reserve, you kind of have three options. So there may be, you can get a protection order possibly through the Family Law Act in say in BC. You could get an order through the federal Family Homes on Reserves and Matrimonial Interests or Rights Act, or you might find that there are options available through band council laws or policies. So always be curious about specific laws that apply uniquely to that community. So in many jurisdictions, family member is defined broadly enough to include not just couples. So it can apply to abuse of older people who are the grandparent or the parent of someone who is harming them. So this excerpt here summarizes what the law says in in Northwest Territories. So it includes and can apply to relationships where people are living together in an intimate or family relationship, where they have a child together, or where there's a person is the parent or grandparent of someone experiencing violence. So it's pretty broad, and it can apply to elder abuse when it's not just exclusively a couple relationship. That wasn't always the case. Some family violence legislation has kind of been amended over the years to make it more inclusive of elder abuse. This slide shows an excerpt of a definition of family violence found in one of the statutes in Canada. I think this is Northwest Territories, but I'm not 100% sure. You'll see quite a bit of similarity across the country anyway. I just wanted to show this slide to highlight that these definitions of family violence are quite broad, and they're very, very similar to the definitions of abuse and neglect that you will find in adult protection legislation. So you see here, and I've bolded some terms, so fear for safety, physical abuse, property damage, sexual abuse, forcible confinement, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, or financial abuse. So it's very broad. The key thing you can do with family violence legislation is get a protection order. And usually that would be the person going to court to get the order with the help from someone that they trust. And each statute will say what kind of terms can be in the protection order, but you'll see a lot of similarities. So I've listed quite a few of them on the slide. So typical provisions would be no contact or communication, requiring someone to stay away from locations where the older person goes, an order for exclusive occupation of a home, order about firearms and weapons. You can get an order for the police to help remove the abuser from the scene or to help the person get belongings so they can leave an abusive place. But often there's a catch-all provision in the legislation that allows the court to do anything that they consider necessary. In BC, I know under the Family Law Act, you can go to court, Supreme or provincial court, to apply for a protection order. And usually you need to apply to start this process in motion. But if there's already a family law proceeding, say two older people are getting separated, if a judge sees that there's an abusive situation, the judge has the power, the justice, to impose a protection order, even if no one is asking for one, if they see family violence happening. So how do you get a court order? You got to go to the court. Somebody's got to go to court and request the court order. Usually there's a hearing. In most legislation, you can get an urgent order without having a full hearing. Because you're going to the court, it's usually helpful if someone has a lawyer. It's hard to represent yourself in court, particularly if you're living with trauma and disability and frailty. Legal aid in most jurisdictions will provide assistance if the person is experiencing violence or at risk of family violence. So I encourage people to apply for legal aid and also to apply for victim assistance if they're thinking about approaching an order. Criminal charges are not necessary. I divide produced this slide to give you just a comparison of civil and criminal protection orders. So you may have heard of something called a peace bond or a Section 810 reconnaissance. This is basically a protection order that the police and Crown can, which is lawyers representing the government, can put in place. So you can get a criminal protection order or a civil protection order. And this table is really just to show you some comparisons between the two. I guess the key difference is that if you're a criminal protection order, nobody has to go to court and apply for one. The police and Crown do all the work. You may have to appear before a judge and say that you feel fear for your safety if you want that order to be put in place. But other than that, there are people who will do all the work. You don't need to worry about paying for a lawyer or finding a lawyer. The other thing is that peace bonds don't just apply to family members. So if an older person is being abused by someone who is not in their family or they're not living with, then a peace bond is an option, but a protection order under the Family Law Act is not an option. But I'll send you the slides so you can sort of compare them in your own time. Now I want to switch gears and just talk very briefly about responding to abuse that happens to older people living in long-term care. Adult protection legislation that I've discussed already does apply to people living in long-term care, but if a person is living in long-term care, there are sort of kind of extra tools in your legal response tool basket, because legislation that applies to long-term care in maybe half of the jurisdictions has some requirements for responding to abuse. And in this context, abuse response is often mandatory because we recognize that people living in long-term care are frail, are vulnerable, and they cannot generally protect themselves. If they could, they probably wouldn't be living in long-term care. You will find two kinds of legislation that applies to abuse and neglect in long-term care in a number of jurisdictions. I'll just go to that slide. There is a piece of legislation a law called the Protection for Persons in Care Act. So that's Alberta, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. So these are very short laws that just apply to abuse and neglect of people living in long-term care. And the legislation has very specific rules for who must respond to abuse. And generally responding is mandatory for everyone in the sense of having to make a report to an agency, and then the facilities must respond to all reports of abuse and neglect. Some jurisdictions have instead a larger statute that applies to abuse and that applies to long-term care that has some rules for responding to abuse and neglect. And this is the case for BC. We have our Community Care and Assisted Living Act and the associated regulations, and Ontario's Long-Term Care Act. They have a new law called the Fixing Long-Term Care Homes Act. The abuse and neglect provisions are the same as before. They just are renumbered. They're found in different parts of the statute, but the rules for responding to abuse and neglect have not changed for Ontario. There's also separate rules for retirement homes, because similar, but it's a separate statute. And Saskatchewan is the other jurisdiction that has a law regarding responding to abuse and neglect. But other jurisdictions don't have legislation, but remember some of those laws that apply to adult protection that I discussed early on in my talk would apply to abuse and neglect in long-term care and require or provide options for response. Generally, responding to abuse and neglect in long-term care is, as I mentioned, mandatory because we recognize that people living in long-term care are vulnerable and they cannot protect themselves. So now I just want to briefly cover our guiding principles for best practice. We have 12 guiding principles for best practice, and they appear on the slide here. It would take me a whole hour to go through them all, so I'm just going to highlight 4 of them that I think are really important. So the first one I want to talk about is listen to the older person. To me, this is quite important. Most people who are experiencing abuse understand enough about what's going on that they can say something about what they want to happen, and their version of what's going on is the story you should listen to. You should talk to them first. It's disrespectful in ages to go behind people's back and figure out what to do about their situation. You may need to pull more people into the team, but your starting place should always be to find a gentle, compassionate way to check in on the older person and find out what's going on. This gentle approach is going to help you to build rapport, and it's going to make all your actions to respond be more effective. Most people don't like to be told what to do. Um, Respect and support decision-making autonomy. So all people of all ages, adults with decision-making capacity, so who understand what's going on, have a right to decide what they want to happen in their lives. Just like in a violence against women situation, we know we don't tell women they have to leave an abusive situation. They make the decision when they're ready and they decide what kinds of help is welcome. So I encourage you to respect the decision-making autonomy of people who are older. Some people who have a disability may not be able to make their own decisions, and then sometimes we do need to kind of figure out what to do for them. But the majority of older people experiencing abuse and neglect have capacity to make their own decisions. Also be careful, like sometimes people seem like they don't have capacity at first, and that might be because they have untreated medical conditions or they are experiencing trauma. Once older people experiencing abuse and neglect have access to support and are feeling safe, they may present as having more autonomy, and it may be clearer to you that they can make their own decisions. So help people to make their own decisions before you consider taking their decision-making power away. Third, seek consent or permission as much as possible. You need consent even to make phone calls, right? You're sharing people's confidential information, even calling the police. In most situations, you're going to want to say to the older person, I think it's time we call the police. Unless you're there when they're being assaulted or they're about to be assaulted, like you can see there's a crime about to happen and an older person is in danger, they're unconscious, yes, then sometimes it's important to do things for them without getting their permission. But when you can, it's good to get permission. It's the ethical way to approach things. And you want to make sure that they continue to give you permission, that they should always be comfortable with how things are unfolding. And people have the right to change their mind and decide, wait, I don't want to go to court, or wait, I don't want the police involved, or wait, I don't want to tell so-and-so. Older people have a right to change their mind, to think otherwise is ageist. Respect the relationships that matter. Often older people experiencing abuse and neglect will do whatever they can to protect the relationships that matter to them. And this can include when people who are harming them, children, grandchildren. You will have no success in helping older people unless you try to understand those relationships. And often that means helping abusive people get help for their own psychiatric issues or substance use issues. But consider helping the person in the context of all the relationships that matter to them, and you may find that your help will be more welcome and will be more helpful in the end. So just some final thoughts on responding to abuse and neglect. There's just no single law that applies, and that's why we developed the practical guide. It's complicated. There are lots of laws, and I encourage you to think of the law as a toolbox. There are different tools you can pull out of your tool basket depending on what is going on and what the person wants. The criminal law does apply across Canada, but it's not the only law that can apply. And criminal response is not always welcome. The Advocacy Centre for the Elderly in Toronto developed this really helpful visual to show you how criminal provisions and elder abuse can align and not align. So physical assault is clearly going to be a crime, but humiliating an older person, maybe that's not a crime, but it's still wrong and the person still needs help in some way. Trying to scare them, maybe that's a threat, or maybe it's not a criminal act. When an older person is told that they have to give over their money or they won't get to see the grandchildren, that could be a crime. That could be a kind of threat. So, but not every kind of elder abuse will be a criminal act. If you're curious to think more about this question, I did write an article for a publication called Bar Talk last December on when elder abuse is a crime in BC. So I invite you to take a look at that. There's a hyperlink here in my presentation on this slide. Often when I have conversations with folks about abuse and neglect, particularly the police, I hear this question, is it civil or is it criminal? And, hearkening back to the slide I just showed you, I think that's not the right question. And I would encourage you to think about other kinds of questions. And I've included some questions that I think are good ones to ask on this slide. Has a crime occurred? Does the older person want or need help? How could the criminal justice system be helpful or maybe harmful? Is there an urgent safety issue? How can we enhance safety or connect the person with helpful safety enhancing resources? Where did the abuse happen, right? If it's long-term care, you have other tools. Is it a family relationship? Does the older person understand what is going on or have capacity? That's kind of like a fundamental question you want to be thinking about. But we always assume capacity, and then, you know, we don't take the power away from people who have capacity. Think about how to support capacity and consider whether there's a need for urgent medical care. Sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. I know that some of you may have read the report by the Seniors Advocate, which was published in last December. And you may have guessed by now that I don't really agree with the call for mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect in BC. We have very nuanced legislation in BC that does allow for responding to abuse and neglect without mandatory reporting. And I do think it's important to interrogate that legal system and see how we can make it better. But mandatory reporting has a lot of negative side effects, even if it sort of provides us with this illusion that somebody's there to fix the problem. Elder abuse actually requires a lot of complex things in order to respond. And, you know, this diagram is sort of intended to show that, like, the whole expression where it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to respond to abuse and neglect. And different people have different roles to play. I borrowed this expression from my friend Marta Rajek, who used to work for Seniors First BC. She has a common term you may hear in terms of abusive and neglect response is complex needs, and it can be overwhelming. But I encourage you to think of this term complexity as an invitation to be really curious and creative about how to respond to abuse and neglect, rather than sort of to overwhelm you. I'm just going to skip this slide. So we do need your help. We would like to keep the practical guide alive. So there's a couple ways that you can help us. Thank you so much for being here to listen to my talk on the practical guide and learn more about it. There are two ways you can help us with the guide, and one is to send us your feedback. If there's things you see that you think are missing, if you hear about things changing, if an organization changes its URL, please send me a note, and I'm happy to update the guide as soon as possible, and also to consider your ideas for how to make the guide better. It's a new website, so your feedback is really helpful in helping us to sort of make it the best resource possible. And also to partner with us, like Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, the BC Association of Community Response Networks. We need funding to keep the guide up to date, right? Laws are always changing, and it's a bilingual resource, so we have to always fund translation. So if you would like to be a private or public sponsor of the guide, please reach out to me and let me know. As I said, you'll get a copy of all the slides for this presentation. But here's some ways to reach me. Here's our social media handle. Here's my email address. There's the web URL. I'm happy to stay on the line and answer questions now. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing. And as I've mentioned to Barb, if there are so many questions that we need more than 10 minutes, I do have some time to stay a little longer. So I'm just going to try to use the right computer to stop my screen share now. Let's see, stop share.
Great. Thank you so much, Krista. That was super informative. And I think an indication of how informative it is that there was actually only one question so far. There's a number of comments, and most of the comments are to thank you for your work and to say how informative this session has been. The question is about the principle of paramountcy, and does it apply here?
An interesting question. I think ultimately we have a federal provincial divide in the Constitution in terms of who can respond to abuse and neglect. And so your provincial and territorial laws are the laws that you need to follow. The federal government does have the ability to create legislation, but they have not created legislation to respond to abuse and neglect. And I think it would be tricky because all the resource agencies that can respond to abuse and neglect are provincial or even more specifically local. I think this is one way where This is one way where response aligns with sort of the work of the United Way, right? It's the local response that supports the older person. In your work, I encourage you to learn about every specific agency that's close to you, so that when you do a referral, you can say, I know Seniors First will do this. You're not doing a generic referral. Rather than thinking about national or federal approaches, I don't think we will see the federal government stepping too far beyond criminal law reform and developing guidelines for long-term care and standards.
Thanks, Krista. We've got another question now. How is undue influence and coercion captured within BC laws regarding elder financial abuse?
Oh, that's a really good question. And to the person who's really interested, if you want to email me, I can also send you, my office produced a 4-page undue influence reference aid. And so I'm happy to send you and everyone else that 4-page document. I sometimes keep a slide on that. So in terms of how undue influence is included in our legislation. So there are a number of ways. So undue influence could be a criminal act, right? So if an older person is, so undue influence for everyone else, undue influence is a situation where a person is, anyone, including an older person, is not doing what they want, but it's doing someone else's will. So someone is kind of controlling the puppet strings behind them, say through abuse or pressure. Often there's pressure about grandchildren or isolation. So when someone is experiencing undue influence, they are also sometimes experiencing a threat, a criminal act. And then if they're being threatened, there may be a role for police to provide support or to respond through prosecution, because undue influence can have some pretty serious consequences in terms of people's well-being and also their financial well-being. We most often see undue influence in the context of pressuring people to sign a power of attorney or a will or give property over to younger people. There are a couple other ways that we say undue influence come up in legislation. So recently, our Community Care and Assisted Living Act was amended so that there is a duty to respond to undue influence in that legislation. And people who work in long-term care are not, or in assisted living, are not allowed to exert any pressure on older people vis-a-vis their assets. That would be undue influence and would be not consistent with the Community Care and Assisted Living Act in addition to criminal code legislation. There are also specific provisions in our laws in BC that apply to creating wills. So the Wills, Estates and Succession Act has specific provisions regarding undue influence, which create a reverse onus where if undue influence is raised, then the person who wants to kind of protect the will and say it should go ahead anyway has to prove that undue influence didn't happen. And so what that means is people who are working with older people to create wills and powers of attorney, if you have any concern about undue influence, you really need to do your due diligence and make sure that it's not happening. Because if a will reflects the intention of another person, not the older person, that's not going to be a valid will. I have a colleague at my office who's working on a project right now on undue influence that's going to enhance our undue influence reference aid to help folks with situations where you think you might be seeing undue influence and it's a digital will, because increasingly we're meeting with older people over the internet, and then it can be hard to see who's behind the screen, like who's outside the frame exerting their undue influence. So we will be publishing kind of amended guide or amended resource shortly to help people in those situations where you're seeing undue influence and it's more of like an online or digital relationship. I hope that's helpful in helping folks understand undue influence and where it kind of is covered in our legislation.
Great. Okay, there's a few more questions that have come in. The first is, does the guide break down which BC agencies to respond to, depending on the type of event or abuse that has occurred? People seem to find it confusing to decide whether to call the police, the health authority, the ombudsperson, etc.
Yes and no. So we do try to indicate in the guide under what circumstances you call different agencies and what their sort of mandate for response is. But unfortunately, when you're experiencing abuse and neglect, there's no like Venn diagram that tells you what to do, and you can plug in the situation and it says do this or call this person. There's always a challenging kind of weighing the situation and figuring out that a person has to do when you're concerned about an older person who's experiencing abuse and neglect. So I'm sorry we can't kind of alleviate you of that challenge. I will mention there's a really useful resource called the Decision Tree, which was produced by the Public Guardian Trustee. You can find it on their website. I can send you a link if you're having trouble finding it. And it explains what the police, the PGT, or the health authorities can and could do if they're contacted about abuse and neglect. And that's a good point. And I'm pretty sure it's linked on our website, on our Practical Guide website. But if it's not, I will add that. The key thing is you call the police if it's an emergency and someone needs immediate help by the police, or you want to have a conversation about how someone could get help, because the police do often have victims assistance associated with their office, and so they can support, problem solving. If you're really unsure what to do, a good place to call is Seniors First BC, because they have victim assistance and legal staff, and they can kind of refer you to the right member of the team to do some problem solving about how to respond. If the abuse involves an adult living with an intellectual disability and the person is at risk of abuse and neglect and you think they don't understand what's going on, the designated agency is community living, where you're calling the designated agencies. So, the health authorities or Providence Health or community living is going to be in a situation where you think the person cannot protect themselves. And if you're struggling with who to call, but the older person does understand what's going on, I encourage you to talk to them. Look at the guide first, see what the different kind of places are, and then have a conversation about what kind of help would be most welcome to them. Because the most welcome help is often likely to be the most effective help. And they are usually the expert in their own experience. So I hope that is helpful. It's tricky. It's really hard to know what to do sometimes, and unfortunately, there's no magic way to avoid that quite painful and traumatic experience sometimes of figuring out how do I support this person that I'm really worried about. And it does take time helping someone. Like, I think sometimes that the mandatory reporting 1-800 centralized response idea feels like a magic eraser or like a Ghostbusters line where we just call and somebody's going to solve the problem for us, and then we can just sit at home and feel safe and good like we solved that problem. But really, it's hard. Helping people who've experienced abuse and neglect or are still experiencing it, it's really hard. So.
Thanks, Krista. We have a follow-up to the question about paramountcy. To be clear, does the provincial counteract the federal or vice versa, in particular in the courts?
I don't see it coming up because they have not created conflicting legislation, to my knowledge, when it comes to abuse and neglect response. So I feel like that question is a bit of a red herring. If you've run into that situation, please email me. I'm really curious to know where you're seeing that kind of challenge. The overarching legislation that we have is constitutional legislation, and also human rights law, which is quasi-constitutional. So anytime legislation violates people's human rights, is discriminatory, then you could consider a human rights challenge federally or provincially, depending on which legislation you're challenging or which office you want to challenge. But I feel like paramountcy is a bit of a distraction when we're talking about this issue. But
okay, we've got one more question, and as Krista mentioned, she can stay a bit past noon because there's actually two more questions. So the next one is relationship of trust included in these types of legislation? And if so, how is it defined?
Generally, no. So a relationship of trust is more like a policy term. And so you see a lot of the academic or international definitions of elder abuse talk about harm occurring in the context of a relationship of trust. But won't generally find those relationships of trust or that term really used in adult protection legislation. Because the laws aren't designed to respond to those situations. Like family violence legislation responds to family violence. Adult protection legislation responds to abuse, neglect, and self-neglect of adults in need of protection. And long-term care, it's for folks living in long-term care. So um, relation abuse of trust type relationships could give rise to abuse that could be create a response requirement under any of those statutes, but the abuse of trust is a language that you find more either in policy or the academic definitions of abuse and neglect, like the Toronto Declaration or the National Initiative for the Care of the Elderly's definition of abuse and neglect. Although there are maybe specific criminal acts that involve like a breach of trust or a breach of fiduciary duty, that would be a kind of breach of trust. And for example, in BC, an attorney under a power of attorney, a representative under representation agreement, there is a trusting relationship there. And if folks are abusing their roles under that, you could make a report to the public guardian trustee. But again, the language of abuse of trust is not going to be in the PGT legislation either.
Great, thank you. So the last question, what about the SAIL program? Charlene says that she has referred several people to this.
Absolutely, and you should. So the SAIL program is a program of Seniors First BC. So when I said previously Seniors First BC, I mean the SAIL program. SAIL is a province-wide program. You can call and get help anywhere in BC. I believe their age marker is 50 now, but it might be 55. You can call if you're experiencing abuse and neglect or if you're concerned about someone experiencing abuse and neglect. The SAIL is kind of like the gateway 1-800 number, and they can provide you with information and advocacy. They might refer you to their victim assistance program where they have like social workers and victim assistants, folks who can help over a more long term, or they might refer you to one of their lawyers for legal advice. So Seniors First BC has a range of kind of help that they can provide, and the SAIL line is kind of the gateway number that you call when you want to get help. But absolutely, thumbs up to Seniors First BC and the SAIL line, and we really do encourage you to kind of start there if you're not really sure what to do and you're in BC.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Krista. That was so informative. I'm just going to quote Zena's comment, which echoed a lot of other comments from people. And she said, just want to say that this is a great guide and Krista's presentation and responses are excellent. So thank you so much, Krista. As we mentioned, the recording and the slides from the session today will be available on CORE in the next day or two. And you will also note it in our next CORE BC and CORE Canada e-newsletters. And if you're not receiving them, go to CORE BC and CORE Canada and you can sign up because you'll get notification of lots of other learning events, news and resources, and recorded webinars like this one. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you for all the work that you do in community to support older adults. And thank you, Krista. Really appreciate you being with us today and sharing your expertise. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for the good questions. And Barb, if you wouldn't mind staying on the line and keeping the slide open for a moment so I can just look at the chat box questions without having to save it. It's helpful to me to see what questions people ask and how they ask them.
Okay, yeah, we could do that. And thanks to Aman too for running the webinar really efficiently as usual.
Thank you, everyone.
Krista, it's Mon here.
Hi, man. I always lose my little scrolling bar and have trouble
Oh,
once I go deeper into one question.
no, no, it's all good. That was really well done. Thanks so much for that. Um, since the webinar is recorded, the chat also is saved as a text file. So feel free to read through now, but if there's ones that you want to capture or go a little deeper into, I can send you that text file.
Okay. Yeah, is it a problem that we're kind of recording me reading quietly? Or can
Yeah,
you just edit that off after?
yeah, I can totally edit it out. You feel free, take your time.
Yeah, it's just, I find it's easier if I just read them quickly.
Yeah.
Principal, typo. Oh, no, that's a typo from the text question. I was curious to see who asked the question about paramountcy, if it was a lawyer or not, because it's such an odd question.
Some of the questions, rather than coming in through the chat, came in through the Q&A tab.
I found the paramountcy. It's actually in the
Yeah.
chat box.
Oh, perfect.
Hey, Barb, are you still on the line?
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you know who Charlene Harrison Hines is? Do you recognize the name?
Nope.
Okay. I was just curious because it's such an, and she's quite persistent about it. So,
Was a good number of people. We had 88 for the most part.
great. Yeah, that's
I
good.
think, what was it, Aman? 130 some registered?
140.
140 registered and 88. So that was good, because sometimes it's only about half of the people who register who actually participate. And it held in the 80s for pretty well most of it until the last 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, so people didn't get bored and leave.
Yeah, no, they didn't. They really stayed. And there were quite a few from Alberta.
You know what? Yeah, the paramountcy question. You know, I think where that comes is that people just want the federal government to solve this problem, and it's overwhelming. That, and I sympathize with the seniors advocates' concern as well. That it's confusing. Where do you call? But it's also confusing where to call when you have a problem in your house. But we can't centralize the answers. That the fact that it's confusing doesn't mean we can simplify it. It's a complex problem, and we have lots of great agencies that are doing their best in their communities and doing a good job.
Yeah. Well, and
But I
I
think the paramountcy is about the government fixing things. I have
yeah.
a feeling it has to do with that long-term care tension. It's very frustrating to see different approaches in different jurisdictions and different agencies provincially, but
Yeah. And I expect that most situations are really, quite unique, although that, they may fit within a broad context, like financial abuse by a family member. But, it's like the relationships. It's the kind of thing that you talked about around the principles, is that understanding and respecting the relationships and what that means to a person, like if accusations start being made and you cut off a few of the key relationships of a person, what are the implications for that? So
yeah, no, it's hard work. My heart goes out to the people doing the frontline work. I don't mostly do it anymore, and because it's so hard, and I working at the meta sort of systems level suits me better now, but it's hard. It's traumatic. It can be like vicariously traumatic. It's exhausting. It's painful to see people suffering and to not be able to fix their problems. But there's just not there's not a quick fix.
well,
So
that's really good, and the examples were really helpful. So yeah, that's really terrific.
yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Your reach is really good, and we just really want to get the guide out there. So, and if the United Way is interested in coming on board as a partner to help with the sustaining of the guide, it also, might be a good fit in terms of your reach. CORE could be like an excellent partner because we have quite an overlap in who we're trying to reach.
Right. Yeah. Well, we certainly, going forward, we have a lot of different, what we call, partner and affiliated agencies, both provincial and national, listed so that there's direct links to different resources and different agencies so that they can reach our audience and vice versa. So cross-promotional kinds of opportunities. So yeah, we're always open to that. And anything, in our e-news, having boosts for, various events or training that you're doing, we can always get it posted directly on the platforms as well as in the regular newsletters, which go out both twice a month, Core Canada every second Thursday and Core BC the first and third Mondays of each month. So always happy to do that. That's what we're here for, right, Amon?
Yeah, no, great. Thank you for sort of amplifying our message. And also you too, if you hear stuff where people are like, it's useful for me to get constructive criticism about the website because it's a work in progress. So if people express concerns or have trouble, feel free to pass those on to me because it just kind of helps us solve problems.
Right.
So
We'll do that.
already people are saying, we updated all the contact information, a few months ago before the translation, and already people have changed their URLs or phone numbers. So it's just going to happen. For sure, the contact info is going to keep getting updated.
Yeah.
So it's great if people send me a message when they change things.
We'll certainly be on the lookout. We know all about that, right, Amon? Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Have a good day.
Bye, Krista. Take care.
Bye, Amon.
Bye.